Uh, my name is Mrinalini Sebastian, and I'm currently interested in looking at historical documents, especially documents from the missionary archives, uh, with the view of discovering the voice of the so-called native Christians in those documents. And in my work, I find the work of the post-colonial critic Spivak very helpful, and I have taken a lot of insights from her work, especially when I look at the old documents and try to ask questions that are relevant in terms of historiographical projects. Now, the essay that I find extremely interesting is the essay called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" This particular essay has been often misread in the sense that people think that it needs a yes or no answer. So usually people say, no, the subaltern cannot speak, or yes, the subaltern can speak. I think it calls for a more complex and nuanced reading. What I like about Spivak's essay is that it really compels you to do what is known as a slow reading. So each time you go back to the essay, you find new things there, things that actually make you think about your own role as the investigator, or as the critic or the scholar who is interested in the issue of the marginalized or the subaltern. So we know that the term subaltern was used in recent times by a group of Indian historiographers who have been who actually brought to light the contribution of the non-elite peasant groups in earning India its political freedom. Now, for Spivak, the role of the investigator, especially the so-called subalternist investigator, or even that of the radical critic, is quite central, because she says it's all about the ethics of representation. How do we speak on behalf of the other, especially in a post-colonial context? How do we speak of the marginalized subaltern groups which do not have access to any of the communication networks that make it possible for us to speak today? So I think this is what she wants to draw our attention to, that just because we belong to a minority group or ethnic minority, we can't really claim the name subaltern. That term is really something that refers to the heterogeneous group of people who occupy the margins of society. So the one thing we need to know is that subaltern is not a homogeneous group. There are different groups which have been denied access to networks of communication in modern democratic setups. So these are the ones whose voice we have not been able to hear well. It's not that they can't speak, but we have not been able to really speak to them in order to make a conversation possible. So the answer that the subaltern cannot speak, or the sort of misreading which says that Spivak has denied them voice and agency, is, in my view, not an accurate reading of the essay. And she takes two examples of two types of critical writing. One, the form of radical criticism that we see in the writings of Foucault. She has actually spoken about an interview that Foucault and Deleuze have, a kind of conversation that Foucault and Deleuze have. And the other example is the work of the Indian historiographers. And in the first case, she seems to be, these are not really negative examples, but in the first case, she seems to be telling us that even though Foucault has generally spoken of power as being micrological and diffuse, we need to remember larger macrological forms of power, such as, for example, colonialism, which is important for her as a post-colonial critic, or globalization, or forms of neo-colonial structures. So, in her understanding, we need to bear that in mind, and also we need to bear in mind that even the most sensitive ways of communicating, talking on behalf of this subaltern. It's actually the word that they use in this conversation is relaying the voice of those who are marginalized. Even that kind of relaying of the voice of the subaltern tends to sort of overlook the role played by the academic, by the critic who is occupying another space in the institutional structures of the West. So that's one of her criticisms there, that we need to be aware of the fact that when we speak, when we try to represent the subaltern, we are actually complicit in the established institutional structures of the world. So that's one critique she has in the case of the conversation between Foucault and Deleuze. The other example, which is in my view the more interesting example, because she continuously calls herself the post-colonial feminist critic, usually refers to herself as a teacher, a comparativist, and a literary critic. So the other example that interests me here is that of the critique she has of the subalternist historiographers. And she says that even though this is a good project, what we don't remember here, what seems to be an elusive figure here, is that of the subaltern woman. There is not much of a reference to the subaltern woman here. And in order to establish this line of argument, she gives us two examples. One of them is an example of widow sacrifice, a much debated cultural practice, which has been a practice that needed to be reformed, and the British colonial administrators and the reformists from India sort of struggled against this practice and managed to legally ban the practice in 19th century. And the opposing group in that debate was that of the so-called nativists, who said that these women committed they actually committed widow sacrifice, or they committed sati, that's the word, because they wanted to. So she's trying to argue that caught between the local and traditionalist patriarchal structures and the modernizing reformist so-called progressivist notions of reform, the figure of the woman, the woman as the subject, is really shuttling between two impossible situations. So she wants us to actually become aware of the ambivalence of this suffering woman in this particular context. And this is something that has been discussed by others too, that while we don't want to say that practice that is harmful, that is violent against women, we shouldn't really be defending it as my culture made me do it. On the other hand, to imagine that every cultural practice needs to be reformed, that is also a problematic. It's a problematic position to hold. The other example that she gives us here is that of the young woman who was part of the nationalist movement, who was asked to do something on behalf of the nationalist movement, but who sort of doesn't want to engage in such an activity and then commit suicide. But her focus here is that this young woman was also using her body to make a statement. And the statement is this, that this was a context where a young woman who committed suicide, if a young woman committed suicide, it would be immediately interpreted as a case where she had become illicitly pregnant in terms of the values of and the value codings of that particular society. And so her argument is that even when she was taking a step to end her life, she had to bear in mind how it would be interpreted by her society. And so she committed suicide when she was menstruating in order to prove that it was not because she was pregnant that she had committed suicide. So these are not easy examples at all. It's very difficult for those who are not part of this culture to understand the logic, and I think that's where she brings in the question of the difficulty of knowing well what she calls the ground level value codings, or in other words, she also says the normativization of the life of a woman in specific cultural contexts, and what actually makes, what actually shapes a young woman in ideological terms. So her essay is quite interesting for me because of what it says about the role of the investigator, and also for what she says about the whole politics of representation.